Good evening. Thank you all for coming. I think we'll get started. Beautiful day out. I wanted to introduce myself. I'm Dietrich Neumann. I teach modern and contemporary architecture here at Brown University. And before I introduce our speaker, I wanted to acknowledge J. Carter Brown. This is part of the J. Carter Brown Memorial Lecture Series. And J. Carter Brown was a member of the Brown family. And very much involved in affairs at Brown, but also very importantly, for 23 years, from 69 to 82, for 23 years, he was the director of the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., organized a lot of major exhibitions there, blockbuster shows, and perhaps more importantly for us, he was also for 23 years chair of the Pritzker Prize Committee of the jury that awarded what's called the Nobel Prize in Architecture. And when he passed in 2002, the Pritzker family of Chicago, after whom the prize is named and that funds it, they wanted to honor J. Carter Brown and gave a gift to the John Nicholas Brown Center of Public Humanities. And that gift was meant to host major architects in a series that we were named after J. Carter Brown, and we've been doing this for now over 20 years, and we've had a wonderful string of lectures which we are continuing today. Before I get to Eric, I wanted to thank the director of the John Nicholas Brown Center, Kevin McLaughlin, who made these funds available for this series, and Victoria Lee Hood, who is here tonight and very much engaged in the organization of this, and Christine Bilodeau, one of our managers who also worked a lot behind the scenes to make all of this possible. So it's really a great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Eric Höweler, back to Brown, because he had a project here and did a wonderful job renovating our John Rockefeller library very elegantly, together with his wife, Mi-Jin Yoon. His firm is called Höweler and Yoon, and so it's wonderful to have you back. There was both the entrance area and the digital studio you did there. And Eric was born in Cali, Colombia, and then, I don't even know why, ended up going to high school in Bangkok. And then from there, and he said it was a bit of a harsh transition, went to study architecture at Cornell, both undergraduate and graduate school, and then went to teach at Harvard and MIT, and then at Harvard. Again, from 2008 onwards, he has been a professor at the Graduate School of Design. In 2004, he founded the firm that I just mentioned to you, Mi-Jin Höweler and Yoon, with his wife Mi-Jin Yoon. And he teaches at Harvard something that's really central to his interest, as you'll see in a moment, in architecture, building technologies, and integration. And he has a very active practice. There are exciting projects in China. He just finished a new dorm at Yale at the Divinity School, built the new MIT Museum, the Coolidge Corner Theater in Cambridge. My students have already seen this incredible curved wall that you produced there out of bricks. At the Venice Biennale last year, he constructed, together with Carlo Ratti, who was the organizer of the entire Biennale, a swimming square, in a way, aqua praça it was called, a sort of public space that was floating in the water. I think it was an homage to the theater that Aldo Rossi did in 1980 there. And it floated first there and then traveled all the way to Belém, Brazil, to become an integral part of the Italian pavilion at the environmental conference COP30 there in Belém. He also designed two amazing memorials, one for the enslaved people that built the campus of the University of Virginia, and the Collier Memorial at MIT, and I think you'll talk about some of this today. He has published 6 books, won a good number of important awards, published in all the major magazines in our field. But I wanted to mention this book, which I received a few months ago from him. It's fairly new. It's called Design for Construction, Tectonic Imagination in Contemporary Architecture. I think, quite honestly, it's the most important book that has been published in decades about architecture, because he traces in it the way materials have an impact on architecture and how they actually can create meaning and depth and a sort of humanity-based approach to architecture that is really profound. And it's a wonderful book, deeply researched and so broad. Global impact is a fantastic accomplishment. On that note, I'd like to welcome Eric on the stage. So please help me welcome Eric Höweler.
Thanks, Dietrich. Wow, what an intro. That's the lecture poster. I gave the lecture this title, Material Monument and Memory, partly because Dietrich was telling me that you were thinking about some of these topics, and I wanted to sort of help think about some of those questions. As we finished the Memorial to Enslaved Laborers at the University of Virginia, we've discovered a problem, and that's that the etched stones, the inscriptions in the stones weren't legible enough. They were carved in the black granite, and you couldn't read the inscription. And then one day I sort of visited, and the sort of fine sort of clay dust had settled in the letters, and the dust made the letters legible. And so the contractor was about to power wash it and remove all the dust. And we said, no, that works, that helps, that's the solution to our problem of legibility. So the masons came and they filled the letters with a grout, which was this clay-colored grout. And if you go there today, the legibility of the letters is a function of the kind of the mixture of dust in the grout that makes the memorial legible. And if you go to Virginia and if you go to any of the construction sites, you see this sort of orange color. And that's somehow, for me, it reminds me of growing up in a volcanic region in Colombia, as you said. But the sort of iconic sort of clay color that you see on construction sites in different parts of the world, it's telling us something about the substance of the material beneath our feet. It is the kind of iron content in the soil which makes it this particular color. My dad's an agronomist, by the way. He's a soil scientist. So I've been thinking about this sort of color, and it sort of, in a way, it sort of grounds you. It sort of tells you where you are. And that specific color I associate with Virginia and that Albemarle County. I was thinking about clay and the difference between clay and sand and silt. And clay is a particular kind of substance. It's malleable when mixed with water. And I think for me, thinking about its malleability, its plasticity makes clay for me a kind of metaphor for pedagogy, for instruction, for shaping things. And when I think about shaping things, I think about what we do with clay. Clay transformed into bricks, the kind of the ore material, the kind of beginning of civilization. And I like to say to my students that the brick size is no accident. It is very particular. It's calibrated both to itself and its modularity and its configuration, but also to the hand of the mason. Right? The mason holds the brick with one hand and the trowel in the other. And there's a kind of rhythm that a mason has between the left hand and the right hand that allows the construction to proceed. I like to say that materials have an ethics to them. They have a means of working, a mode of working. And I took this picture in Klippan, Sweden, a couple summers ago when I dragged my dad and my daughter to Sweden to see this particular church by Sigurd Leverance. And you notice something weird about this, and that the bricks are kind of floating in the mortar. There's a kind of excess of mortar, and the staggered edge on the left, which I could say is the design, and the means and methods, which is maybe the way the brick is arranged, was very deliberate. Sigurd Leverance insisted that no brick be cut. And so every brick is whole. And so you get these weird moments where the mortar is sort of making up for the kind of shifting of the bricks. And we see this throughout the church, both in the floor and the floor modules and in the vaults and the ceiling. There's a kind of excess of mortar. But there's also a kind of beauty where the part-to-whole relationships are sort of manifested as the bricks are jostling for position in the floor, and the sort of ragged edge is telling us that there's a kind of logic to its making, and that logic is legible. So I've been interested in this kind of legibility of the kind of part-to-whole relations within architecture and the kind of ethics that they imply. Recently, I was discovering this project, this piece. It's a Joseph Albert's mural in the Harvard Law School. And I found it because my daughter needed a bathroom, so we went in there. And I found it in the hall, and I'd seen it published, but never experienced it. And so I went up close, as I do, and I sort of looked at it. It's a mural, but it's really just the depth of the brick. It's certain bricks are missing. And the mortar, and the joint, and the gap between the bricks, and look at the shadows in those gaps of the joints. And so this is a very deliberate sort of meditation on a material, on its effects, and the care with which it's assembled, I think, is quite inspiring. I came across this book by Chris Bemphy, who teaches at UMass, I think, UMass Amherst. It's called Red Brick, Black Mountain, White Clay. And it's a kind of biographical book. He sort of researches his family, his origins. His aunt is actually Annie Albers, so he's kind of looking for his origins. But he tells an incredible story about the red brick from North Carolina, the Black Mountain School of Art, and the white clay that was this elusive substance that was used for shaping pottery. So it's a book about pottery and origins, but it's also about thinking and making. And I love the idea that craft is not just the repetition of a tradition, it's actually the process of thinking while doing. And that's a pretty good definition for me. I also like this image of shaping, and I think about pedagogy and sort of shaping ourselves as architects, shaping architects, training architects to be skilled. And I say my theory of clay is that we need lots of it to make good potters, and we need, in a way, lots of architecture to make good architects. Going to another point of origin, this is the University of Virginia, which you all know. This is the academical village designed by Thomas Jefferson. In my architectural history class, I learned about the rotunda, I learned about the pavilions, I learned about the gardens, the serpentine walls that are sort of so famous. I used to teach these in my construction class because I think they're so clever. The single width of brick is actually more stable than a double. And here's Jefferson doing the calculation. If I curve the wall, I can use this many bricks. If I support the wall with intermittent piers, I need this many bricks. And so for him, it's a kind of rational process of arranging bricks and economizing, finding stability with a kind of geometry that's in a way self-stabilized. That's how I used to teach it. Later, I learned that these walls are separating the world of the students and the faculty from the world of the enslaved. And that gave that wall a different meaning. So here's a statue of Thomas Jefferson at the University of Virginia, at the business school. And you see him with a plan and a sextant. He's sort of looking into the distance. He's the ideal Renaissance man. He's the author of the Declaration of Independence. He's a landowner. He's an architect. He does all these things. There's no mention of him as a kind of slave owner, an enslaver. I went to Monticello because I understood that there were certain bricks that had fingerprints in them. And these fingerprints, you see them right there, 3 little fingerprints. These fingerprints were from the enslaved boys that were making bricks. They would squeeze the brick to test its sort of dryness before they fired it. So a lot of bricks have fingerprints in them. But the fact that these were facing out suggested to me that the mason knew what they were doing. They were either turned in or turned out. And in this particular corner, there's a number of bricks that have those fingerprints in them. And I have to imagine that the mason was making a kind of a declaration here. And he was saying, we were here. Here's my trace. Here's my fingers. And so that gave me a completely different understanding of Monticello. We also learn about this in architectural history class. It's a kind of masterful arrangement of Palladian forms. The bricks that I mentioned are just around the corner where that lady's standing. And if you go there, you can find the bricks with the fingerprints. And for me, that's kind of a way to think about architecture differently, about the labor that assembled it, under what conditions. And the history of Monticello and the history of UVA, for me, was forever transformed by learning about the history of enslavement there. This is the academical village, as we know, and these are the gardens that are beautiful. And if you go to UVA, you might experience these gardens. What I didn't know was that these gardens were actually landscapes, plantation landscapes. And my understanding of UVA has been shifted by scholarship that sort of identifies how UVA was conceptualized. And so this image, this beautiful etching that shows the iconic lawn with the 10 pavilions, notice that the pavilions are spaced differently. They're closer together. As you get close to the rotunda, it produces a kind of compression, a kind of false perspective. There's also the topography, and each of the pavilions is different. But here, hiding in plain sight, is something that was the sort of the substructure of UVA. It was built on the labor of the enslaved, and here we have right there, right in the etching, hiding in plain sight, is an enslaved woman caring for a white child. I understand that this is something that was understood but not spoken, and that sort of deafening silence, I think, produced a sort of a kind of unease amongst some people. Recently, UVA decided to acknowledge its history, and we were asked to design a memorial to recognize that history. So this is Professor Lewis Nelson, who's a UVA architectural historian. He was giving us a tour, and he pointed to this building, and he said, "How many stories is that?" And I said, "It's 2 stories." He said, "Yes, but no. It's actually 3 stories because the backside is a 3-story structure." This is Lewis Nelson's book, Educated in Tyranny, which he co-authored with Maury McGuinness, 2 architectural historians teaching at UVA, rewriting the history of probably the most written about of American architectural structures, and certainly one of the first American campus designs. They produced these renderings which show the original arrangement of buildings. You know, these yards are not gardens, they're work yards, they're labor yards, they're, you know, livestock yards, they're vegetable gardens. And this is the section that we cut to sort of explain the idea that certainly on the lawn it looks like a 2-story building, but on the backside it is a 3-story building because the basement, the walkout basement, is the quarters for the enslaved. And Jefferson's, you know, intelligently sited the building on a ridge, and so we have the ground falls away on both sides. That allows that walkout basement to work. When we interviewed for this project, we assembled a team with Mabel Wilson, who's an architect and a historian, with Frank Dukes, who's a community organizer, with Greg Bleem, who's a landscape architect, and Eto Otitigbe, who's a visual artist. And with this team, we went to UVA and said, we'd like to work with you to think about this really difficult question. Mabel had been a student at UVA, and she talked about her experiences there. She also said something which was astounding in the interview. She said it's a place of reflection, contemplation, but also needs to be a space of joy. And at that moment when she said joy, to celebrate the lives of these people, these families that lived at UVA, the whole mood in the room changed. It was like she said something unimaginable because everyone was sitting in the room thinking about the horrors of this institution. And here she said it needs to be a place of joy, a place for celebration of their lives in the present. That was not the mindset in the room at the time. But we did embark with this team on a 6-month process of listening, meeting with descendants, and making proposals. So here we are with Mabel and Frank in our studio, looking at sites, different sites. There was no site given. We had to study different sites. And we did meet with students. We met with descendants. We landed on a scheme which is pretty much described right here, which is a community standing in a circle, in a kind of embrace. And in a way, this is the memorial at its most minimal. A community seeing itself in a circle. The design is a circle. It's a series of cones that are intersecting. The cones begin quite low, and they sort of rise up. And on the outside, we have a kind of rough texture. On the inside, we have a smooth texture, and we have the names of those enslaved on the inside. And then in the middle, there's a ring which has the inscriptions that I mentioned at the beginning. Here's the memorial constructed relative to the rotunda, so it's just down the hill. And this was important because some people said, why don't you put it in the lawn? That's not possible. But it turns out when we spoke to the descendants, they said, we don't want it there. We don't feel comfortable there. We don't go there. The university they refer to as the plantation. Why would I go there? I don't feel comfortable there. So this site is just down the hill. It's actually, I call it the front steps of the institution, and to get to the rotunda, everyone passes by it. But what surprised me is that the rotunda is a sphere, approximately 80 foot in diameter. Our memorial is a cone, which amazingly was 80 foot in diameter. It wasn't a design intent. It was just, we drew it. That was the right size. And then when we put them in relationship to each other, we discovered that they're about the right size for hosting a gathering of people. to bring people together. We mock things up. So Boris is standing there with his feet at the bottom. The wall goes up. He reaches out, touches the wall. The connection between his hand and his foot is sort of the slope of the cone. And Caleb's standing over there, and he can't see Boris because there's this new horizon line between them. And we sort of designed it as this sort of this landform. In a way, it sort of rises out of the ground. It's a carving in the ground. It rises up. We see the geometry here. There's a bench with a water feature over here. We always mock things up, and so we sort of built this mock-up to sort of test the relationships. But as architects, we test and we test and we test, and then we build, and it's amazing when it's built. It feels both familiar and strange, uncanny. We worked with Eto, as I said, and Eto was a visual artist who was tasked with inscribing in the memorial a visual figure. And the descendants said, we don't want too much abstraction. We need to see something legible, accessible to everybody. So Eto found this portrait of Isabella Gibbons, who was an enslaved woman who was at UVA. And then he found this tombstone from that period of time, and he was sort of impressed by the roughness of that stone, the way it had been carved, and sort of the kind of cleft face of that stone. And this portrait of Isabella Gibbons, those were sort of his inspirations. Isabella Gibbons was enslaved by a professor at UVA, and she learned to read and write, and she wrote about her experiences. So we actually have a photograph of her. We have her writings, and we understand that after the end of the Civil War, after Liberation Day, she stayed in Charlottesville and became a teacher and wrote about her experiences. So Eto was interested in using her portrait in the memorial, which is interesting. I noticed the stamp at the bottom there. It says Boston Public Library, and I thought, that's odd. Why is it not the Charlottesville Public Library? Isabella Gibbons was enslaved by William Barton Rogers, whose name is carved above the door at MIT. You know, the founder of MIT was the enslaver of Isabella Gibbons at UVA when he was a professor at UVA. So these stories, they wind back and around, and we think because we're in the Northeast, we're sort of separate from that. That happened down there, but it's everywhere. And as soon as you start digging, you find these incredible. It's astounding. I can't walk into MIT anymore without seeing that name and thinking, oh my God, this history is tied to these other histories. Eto Otitigbe, that's his portrait in the middle. He photographed himself in a hoodie as a kind of protest against the sort of killing of black men in hoodies. He's from Africa. He was inspired by these sort of statues, and he translated his portrait into a graphic, not a graphic, actually a material. He carved his face into a stone to reveal his portrait in the shadows between the face of the stone and the depth of the carving. So working with Eto, he took Isabella Gibbons' eyes and sort of carved them in the stone in a way that varied the depth. And so by varying the depth, you vary the shadow. And that produced the portrait of Isabella Gibbons just carved in the stone. Varying the depth of the groove varies the shadow and translates an image into a series of lines. And so when we carve the stone, we sort of introduce that sort of cleft face, the sort of rough texture of the stone, but we also have these grooves that evoke the quarry marks that we find in stone after it's been quarried. And working with Eto, we sort of varied the grooves to introduce the image of Isabella Gibbons' eyes. And so we took a raster image and translated it into a series of toolpaths that changed the depth of the carving to produce an image in the textures. And sometimes you see it and sometimes you don't. But you see the two eyes, right? You know, one eye here, one eye there. You sometimes have to squint at it, and sometimes you don't see it because the sun isn't in the right place. But I think that's okay. I think sometimes a memorial speaks to you differently. Actually, if you look at that image, you see it more clearly. Sometimes the resolution of the screen reveals something, but the resolution of the sun also varies. And so sometimes you go and you don't even see it, but sometimes you go and it just leaps out at you. And that's kind of amazing. When we were under construction, of course, there's the orange clay the sort of rich color of Charlottesville. Here we are starting to lay the panels, and you see the sort of names inscribed there. I describe the project as a horizon line. It's a bounding circle. It sort of takes us from the everyday. We're walking around, we enter the memorial. It's quite low. You see, it's just at your ankle. But you walk in, you take a few steps, and then the line rises, and before you know it, it's over your head because the path is sloping down about a foot. And at a certain moment, the city disappears, everything falls away, and all you're doing is focusing on the interior, which is what we want. We want to create a space of introspection within the sort of hustle and bustle of the city. I say we carve it out of the everyday, of the possibility of contemplation. The biggest challenge here was the names. We didn't have the names. The historians and archaeologists had studied texts, records, and they'd found about 4,000. They thought 4,000 was the estimate of enslaved people. But most records refer to extra hands. They don't refer to them as humans, they refer to them as property or labor to be extracted. And so one of our challenges was trying to accommodate 4,000 individuals without knowing their names. So how do you memorialize individuals without names? Working with Mabel, we developed what we call the genealogical cloud, a set of grooves, of markers that were stand-ins. They were placeholders for names. If we didn't know the name, we had a placeholder just to reserve that space. And I thought it was powerful to see 4,000 marks, 4,000 of something. When we didn't know their full name, we just used their first name. When we didn't know anything about them, references to farmer, to woodcutter, to bricklayer, to cook. And then we also included kinship, mother, daughter, father. These were families, these were communities. And so that's what we carved in because we didn't know the names. And the unknowability of the names was also kind of powerful. I was there in the summer when there was a flash thunderstorm. It rained and then it stopped and then the rain dried up. And then I looked and I saw the water spilling out of the grooves. They looked like tears or like blood. They looked like wounds. It looked like the memorial was bleeding. And I thought, oh my God, that's incredible. That's so powerful. I hadn't thought about that. I hadn't anticipated that. But I asked Mijin, I was like, did you know this was going to happen? I mean, she said, of course I knew. Of course the water would pool like that. Of course it would have this effect. But sometimes architecture surprises me. The material and the environment conspire to produce an effect that is greater than the sum of all of its intentions. And I think that's kind of one of the beauties of architecture. So this is the memorial with the rough outside and the smooth inside. When it was completed, that was right as COVID hit and right after George Floyd was murdered. So it sort of coincided with this sort of perfect storm, the pandemic, the murder of George Floyd, the protests. And so it became a memorial not just for the distant past, but it became a kind of site, a presence within the present. And people came here to take a knee and remember George Floyd and be together in community at a time where it was very difficult to be in community. It was very difficult to find this sort of shared values that we could hold together. And because it was the pandemic, we couldn't travel. So we were receiving these images from friends in Charlottesville of events that were happening at the memorial. The memorial was being used for things we could not have imagined. This is the UVA Medical School taking a knee for the approximately 9 minutes. And I realized that architecture is more than just material. It's more than just space, even though as teachers we talk about space and material. But it's really a site of convening. It's a site of meaning, and it brings people together. And I think no other medium can do that as effectively. bringing people together. I noticed this memorial recently, and I think Brown has grappled with its own challenges, with its difficult histories. I also noticed this memorial, and I know you're also thinking about these questions. So I've been thinking about this and how do we think about memory in the age of, a kind of attention economy, when we're all sort of staring at our phones and distracted with everyday life. How can we be contemplative? And I think that's one of the hardest challenges for designers is to carve out of the everyday, the business as usual, the sort of stampede to get to where you're going, and be thoughtful, to be introspective. The other memorial Dietrich mentioned is the Collier Memorial at MIT, which we just had the marathon this week, right? This was a result of the marathon bombings in 2013. Sean Collier was killed by the domestic terrorist that stole his gun and shot him in his car at MIT. This was the first time MIT had experienced this kind of tragedy. And people said, what should the memorial be? And they came up with things that, like they said, well, Sean loved nature, and so maybe it should be like a big stone, like a cairn, a kind of memorial stone. And some people said, well, he was a police officer, it should be patriotic, we need flags, we need stars and stripes. And someone said there should be trees and there should be water. Like, these are the things that people think about when they think about memorials, but these are tropes. These are reference points. And our job as designers was, how do we bring all these desires and aspirations into a synthetic, singular structure? So this question of stars and stripes, MIT has this sort of hand in mind. And so we wondered about, memory in the age of communication. And, I took this picture, it's an LED sign of the tunnel in Boston, and they were sort of, acknowledging heroes, but what is a contemporary memorial today? Is it a flicker on a screen? Is it something made of stone? And we really started with really open questions. MIT had this campaign, MIT Strong, Boston Strong, Collier Strong, and I wondered, what is strength relative to community? They added mens manus fortis, strength, to their motto. So we proposed something that we thought embodied what a memorial should be, which is a kind of an acknowledgement of absence, right? If there was a boulder, maybe the missing boulder would be the memorial. So we would go here and say, there was something here before, and now it's gone. And I wanted people to feel that absence in their stomach, not intellectual absence, but something you would feel. So we proposed this form. Some people say it looks like a hand, an open hand. But this is the site. It's right next to Frank Gehry's Status Center. So not a space of attention, right? The Status Center is the most distracting building you can imagine. So how do you create a space of quiet and calm right at the site where he was killed? His car was parked where that black square is. And so the memorial became a kind of sighting device. If you look between two of the buttress walls, it would frame the site of his car. But it's also a kind of passageway. It's kind of a gateway on campus from a very busy corner on Vassar Street. We did work with MIT students. We proposed that it be made out of solid stone. And because it's MIT, we said, maybe it's a technology, an ancient technology like an arch. But it's a super high-tech arch. It's both ancient and high-tech because its geometry is unusual. It's incredibly shallow. A Gothic arch is very vertical because it's shedding those loads right down. This is extremely horizontal. But the length of the buttresses are a response to the thrusts of the stone. And so the geometry is that sort of ovoid that's missing, the boulder that was asked for, the boulder that's missing. But we worked with John Oxendorf, who's a professor and structural engineer at MIT, and Hauke Jungjohann from Nippers Helbig in Stuttgart, and Sam Morelli from Suffolk Construction, and we sort of figured it out. No one had built an arch in any recent memory, right? We forgot how. The principle is clear. We know that a stone tries to fall, and it can't fall because it's supported by two other stones, and those are supported by other stones, and so on until they reach the ground. Those principles are clear, right? The compression structure. John Oxendorf pointed out, Hooke's law, which is so hangs the chain, so inverted, stands the arch. A pure compression arch is the catenary. And so this diagram shows the catenary arch and the catenary chain. Ours is not catenary, it's actually incredibly shallow. But with John's students, we calculated the thrust of each stone, the weight of the stone, the kind of force vector, and the way it sort of is transmitted from stone to stone. And of course, I wondered what was below, what's beneath our feet. The geotechnical reports showed clay, showed all the different substances below, and all those forces are going into the ground, but where are they going? And of course, engineers wonder, where does it go? And of course, we have micropiles to resist that load, right? Every force is a reaction, so there's a grade beam. So as that stone is thrusting into the grade beam, it's being pulled together by that grade beam, and then supported on those micropiles. We did learn going through the process that there was a duct bank in the middle of the site that didn't show up on the civil plan. This was all the power and data to MIT, not something you want to mess with. We discovered it early enough, so luckily we were spanning over the duct bank, and we didn't have to move the memorial at all. But we did design it with each of those blocks identified, modeled, and then transmitted to the fabricator. And we procured the stone because this is a bigger stone than typical. Most stone is slabbed for countertops, and this is not a countertop, it's a keystone. So the keystone, the equipment to shape the keystone, and the drawings we produced. These are most beautiful drawings because they look like masonry drawings from the Gothic cathedrals, right? We're sort of showing the shape. We're also dimensioning the bounding box, and we're procuring the stone to match each of these shapes. So we went to the quarry and picked each stone. And then we learned about the cutting. And the story that I tell, which blew my mind, is that, you know, as the saw cuts the stone also cuts the saw. So the fabricator said, well, how big do you think the saw is? And I said, surely you know how big that saw is. And he said, but every time I cut, it gets smaller. Even though it's a diamond-tipped saw, the saw diameter is reducing. And so if you insist on precision of your AutoCAD file or your Rhino model, you have to think about the material pushing back and the material wearing the other material, which is the saw. And so even the question of calibration of equipment to maintain the accuracy that's implicit in our documentation and our digital workflows was something that was a lesson learned, I'll say. As we were fabricating, we're also doing quality control and verifying dimensions because we don't want to ship a stone if it's not perfect. And we need perfection because we need those stones to transmit loads. And the risk, of course, is that a stone, if it's not fitting perfectly, won't transfer the loads perfectly, will create concentrated loads, potentially spontaneous breakage, and then we don't want any sort of collapse. John Oxendorf said, there's no way it'll collapse. This will be here for 1,000 years. The architect and the engineer of record said, we need redundancy. And so there was a big debate about, can it simply rely on compression or do we need some tension? And John said, no tension, it's all compression. We can do this. But we do need to transfer loads. So the blocks, the measurements, the precision, we went back and forth. Before a stone was set, it was verified. It's a beautiful granite with a white vein in it. And you see the vein traveling through and around the bends. And I always like to show it off three-dimensionally because you can imagine that vein moving through the block. It's not a two-dimensional surface treatment. It is a vein that is moving through the block, and you can visualize that because the block is solid. If it was just a veneer, you would never see that sort of movement. But the memorial completed has the beautiful five-sided keystone. It's irregular. The geometry of the keystone is perpendicular to the thrust line and the center line of each of the buttress walls. And so you can sort of read, in a way, the geometry of the thrusting. This is the first keystone, the ring stone. They're coming together. I always thought the keystone went last, right? That's what history tells us. You put up the scaffold, you build the stone, the keystone goes last. We asked the mason, they said, I'll put the keystone first. And I said, why would you do that? They're like, well, it's five-sided. That's 10 faces that have to be perfect. We're not going to get 10 perfect faces. The keystone's never going to fit. Let's start with the keystone. We'll bring the stones around it, and we'll build the memorial from the air down to the ground. And that's what the mason preferred, and that's what we did, because they know better. So we started with the keystone, we worked our way down. It was an incredibly snowy winter. Everything was measured, verified, tested before it went in. This is a drawing that shows the interfaces of the stones. We always talk about the surfaces, but this is every face that's touching every other face, which is actually what makes this memorial work, because you're transferring load through each of those faces. And you'll notice that this joint is not vertical, it's actually leaning out, because the keystone is sort of, the geometry is sort of radial like that, because it's perpendicular to the thrust line as it arches towards the ground. And I like the fact that it's legible, so you can read the structure. You can say, I see the force going through this. And that step, it's because the stone on the outside is resisting the thrust of the stone that's trying to push it over. And so it is a kind of diagram of forces. I say force is something almost invisible to architects, engineers. We have an understanding of how it's flowing, but we can't actually see it. We can only see the material resisting it. So here's an elevation. We see the sort of micropiles below ground. John Oxendorff's team measured all the scaffolds and their weight. He said you can't see force, but you can measure it. So we measured it. And as they removed the scaffold from the center, the load from the centerpiece transferred to the ring beams, from the ring beams to the buttress stones. And we could see the arch starting to function, starting to work. And after 8 hours of removing scaffold, we got the first time we could see a glimpse of this sort of missing figure, the sort of absent boulder. And this is all the construction crew that were so amazed to discover that void in the center of their labor. And this guy, Rob Rogers, shockingly, Rob was the brother of Sean Collier. So he was the site superintendent, and he was put on the project, but he basically built the memorial to his brother, which is, he said, cathartic. But here it is. Is it a hand? Is it a star? What is its meaning? I think as long as you appreciate that there's something missing, I think that's valuable, that's powerful. If you go, you'll see this sort of hollow. You'll hear a kind of acoustic condition where the geometry is sort of focusing sound. At nighttime, the lighting, you'll see the lights are kind of irregular. You'll notice the three at the top there, that's Orion's belt. And so these are constellations, and this is the diagram of the stars in the sky the night that Collier was murdered. And so, in a way, the memorial has many layers of meaning. Some people notice, some people don't notice, and I think that's okay. I think they need to find meaning in it, and there needs to be enough room for interpretation. That's what we learned about designing meaningful structures that are conveying meaning. I was thinking about one of our first projects that we did in 2004. This was for the Athens Olympics. And we won a competition to design a temporary light installation. So it's fiber optics and microcontrollers. Mijin was at MIT. She was taking a class called How to Make Almost Anything at the Media Lab. As a faculty, you can take classes. As long as you get a B or higher, you don't have to pay tuition. So she was terrified that she wouldn't get a B and then she'd have to pay all this money for this class. But she took a class. She worked with this guy, Matt. They designed microcontrollers. They talked about infrared sensors. And we proposed this idea that this field of light would respond to your body as you move through it. And so with a bunch of MIT students, we built, assembled, shipped, and installed what became white noise, white light, which was a kind of fiber optic field with infrared sensors. It became a responsive landscape, an immersive environment. In 2004, we were super excited about the potential for media to be a material for architects. And we talked about it as that. We said, there's brick, there's stone, there's glass, there's steel, there's wood, and there's media. And we need to think about media as one of the things that as part of the palette for architecture. Afterwards, it came back to MIT, and it was used at the inauguration of Susan Hockfield, the MIT president. But our heroes at the time were Charles and Ray Eames, as you can imagine, architects that didn't recognize any boundaries between graphic design and furniture design and architecture and film. And Charles was asked, what are the limits of design? He said, what are the limits of problems? There are no limits to design. Basically, I can think about all these questions. And so our practice started like this. This is us in our apartment soldering electronics not something we learned in architecture school, but something that allowed us to do things like this, responsive LED nets, things like this, things like this, and things like this. So our first sort of moments of practice were all these immersive environments. This was taking wind power and making it legible with sort of little wind turbines that would sort of allow you to see the wind and visualize energy, not as an invisible thing that comes from a power plant somewhere, but something that could be produced here in a clean way. In 2009, we published this monograph talking about expanding practice, thinking about media and materials. We published dresses and books and installations and landscapes. In 2021, we published a book called Verifying Field, which is a kind of different chapter where we started to think about material after media, after robots, after scripting, and how might we think about architecture differently there. And so this is the quarry that the stone at UVA came from, but it represents a shift in our thinking between simply using electronics to sort of think about behavior, now using, in a way, more traditional architectural means in unconventional ways. And I want to show a couple projects from our second chapter, I would say. Traveling in China, we were invited to do a project on Site G. It was meant to be a courtyard building, a series of courtyards with pitched roofs. And we thought we could be clever and learn from history, but produce something quite contemporary. So our scheme is up there. All the other architects tried to interpret the courtyard house. We were all told we failed. The client said, I don't recognize any of these things. I have no Chinese feeling. And they almost fired us all. So he sent us to look at Chinese architecture. And we looked at Suzhou, and we saw the relationship between the wall or the boundary and the garden. And the garden is a kind of bounded landscape, a microcosm of a bigger idea. We looked at the kind of phenomena of architecture. This is a temple at sunrise in the fog. And my colleague, Chinese architect, said, that's Chinese feeling. That's what you need to design. And I said, how do you design that? I don't know. You cannot draw it, you cannot specify it, but you need to sort of arrive at something that's interpretable or legible to a person to say, yes, this speaks to me. I can identify with it. So we redesigned our project, a series of courtyards, a kind of facade of punched windows arranged in a composition. We submitted our drawings. These were done in 2009, so it seems like eons ago. We submitted our drawings, we detailed the windows, and then we didn't hear anything for 6 months until they called and said, we're under construction. And I said, what? And they're like, we changed the site. There's a different site. And we changed the program. And we actually took your plan and we mirrored it because it fit better on the new site. And I thought, oh my God, what is this? It's not our site, it's not our program, it's not our drawings. It is our drawings. But they built it more or less the way we drew it. And I say in China, it's not less is more, it's more or less. Right? It's almost what you drew, but a little bit different. So it looks a little bit like what we drew. It looks a lot like what we drew. And one of the questions was, how do we give it that Chinese feeling? And we said, how about this gray brick? It's a beautiful material. It's everywhere, pervasive. It comes from the mud, the clay mud of that place. And so it's going to lock it in. It's going to tie it to that place. We had detailed the brick as the sort of base. The punched windows are the kind of exception. And we started to feather the brick. And we feathered the brick in a way that there's the brick. And we said, if you had a compass in every brick, the brick would always be cardinal. That's the rule. It's not Leverance says don't cut the bricks. It's Höweler and Yoon. The brick is cardinal no matter what. And so every brick is north, south, east, west. And the plan of the building has all these angles in it. So when an east-west wall turns to a kind of northwest wall, we get the feathering. But the bricks are always constant. The bricks know where they are. They're oriented. And so this simple idea organized all the bricks and gave it a distinctive texture. And you see a kind of transition from here to there. And in a very subtle way, it orients you around the building, but also in a sort of larger sort of a larger context. But it has this beautiful relationship between outside corners and inside corners. And when the client saw that, he said, yes, I have that Chinese feeling. I feel like it's Chinese, even though it's completely modern. So it's modern, it's contemporary, it has a kind of contemporaneity. It's surprising, but it's also rooted to the place. And I think that was the lesson learned there. We've been doing more work in China. This is the Shanghai Expo site from 2010. It was an industrial zone, and it's proposed as a park. And we did a competition for these two pedestrian bridges in the park. It's an artificial park, it's an artificial lake, but we were asked to do two bridges. So I said, well, we have two bridges. Instead of two bridges, let's do one bridge with a hole in it, framing the water, reflecting the sky. And so we proposed this pair of bridges, and I went to China, I presented it to the client through an interpreter, and I said it's one bridge with a framed view of the sky. And I said, it's not about geometry, it's about relationships. It's about landscapes. It's not about a Western understanding of space, it's about an Eastern sort of looser set of relationships. And these moments where you're looking out over the water, I think those are the contemplative moments. So I made a relationship between this bridge and some of the sort of Chinese paintings where you see a kind of scholar sort of looking out over a landscape. And so those sort of moments, those sort of solitary moments of contemplative landscapes, I tried to incorporate into this bridge, into these kind of snouts. We won this competition, but they didn't tell us. So they were working on it for 6 months, and then they said, we can't seem to get it approved. Can you come back and help us? So we said, of course. We started working with them to refine the geometry, working with the engineers to figure out its structure. And during COVID, they built it. Amazing. So you see the park, there's an old expo pavilion. What I didn't realize at the time was that it's a bridge over a lake. The lake is artificial, but the lake is over a parking garage. So where do you put a parking garage? Well, you put it under the lake. And so there's a lake over parking, and there's a bridge over the lake. But they did it exactly as we drew it. We talked about a formed site cast concrete hull, and they built a concave, a torus-shaped formwork to produce this sort of underbelly. And we said we'd like the granite blocks to run across the pavers and then turn up and start to show us the size and module of the block. I wanted to see the texture of the block. And so these are the images of the completed bridge with these moments, and that looks like a Chinese painting, right? There's the scholar looking out over the landscape, writing poetry in the rain. There's individuals coming, there's people with their families, there's the fishermen in the boat. You know, it evokes a kind of history, a kind of memory of a place, but it doesn't reproduce it and it doesn't mimic it. It's familiar but strange at the same time. In that light, we've been working in historic contexts, and I think maybe in New England we can't escape them, but I think we've learned a lot about working with history. This is, it looks like UVA, but it's not. This is Yale. This is the Divinity School at Yale, which was modeled on UVA. It's by Delano and Aldrich, 1931. And at our interview, I said, how do you add to something that's already complete? It's perfect. It's symmetrical, it's axial, there's 10 pavilions, 1 chapel. What can we do? But the dean at the Divinity School wanted to add a dormitory. And the site of the dormitory is in that parking lot. And it turns out, with 10 pavilions, you've got 11 front doors, and nobody can find the front door of the Divinity School. Turns out, the front door of the Divinity School is where you'd expect it to be. It's next to the parking lot. It's right there. Nobody can see it from Prospect Street. They come up, they open the door to the chapel. And so the proposal was to add a dormitory on that parking lot. This is a living building challenge project, so it's a super high level of sustainability, which means we have to think about materials, health, energy, water, place, but also beauty. beauty and equity are petals within the Living Building Challenge rating system. And so it's kind of an incredible project to think about how do you add to something historical like this, make it sustainable. And we thought maybe we need to think about, the building arts, something beautiful, crafted, the building equity, how does it participate in its community, and building science, how do we sort of create a state-of-the-art building? So this was the plan. We arrived at this after a lot of work, but there's an axis here, there's a cross-axis here. We organized the building as a kind of U-shape that centers on the entrance to the Divinity School. This was the old parking lot. And we created a portal over here. So from Prospect Street, you see the portal, and you know where to go. The form of the building is shaped by its relationship to the gabled roof of the original, but the roof form changes because it needs to face the south. So north is that way, south is that way. And so the roof changes like a sunflower. It faces south to sort of optimize its solar orientation. And all the roof is clad in PVs. So the roof angle, it's all PVs. We have all surfaces producing energy. We manage all the stormwater on site. It's filtered, processed, and I wanted to make the water legible so that students living here have a better understanding of their environment than simply in an air-conditioned box. So the roof form is also capturing water. It's making the water visible through the water feature, and the water treatment is also visible to students. So that's the building built. You see all the PVs on the roof. You see the relationship between the historic gable and the new gable, and then the gable sort of shaping itself to face the sun. This is the new gateway, this new portal. You come through here, and you come in here, and then you see the new front door. This is how we explained it to the client. We said, you have a gabled roof. We transformed the traditional gable into this solar collecting gable. And I noticed both at UVA and at the Divinity School, there's moments where the brick is non-painted and then it's painted and it turns right on the edge. Somehow Jefferson whitewashed certain bricks, and also Delano and Aldrich did this. So I thought, that's interesting. Maybe we have the same sort of transitions where we have a kind of rich terracotta color and then we transition to a glazed tile. And so we reference the historic building without copying it. Here we see the sort of horizontal textures, the vertical glazed textures. This is another aperture. The rain chain makes the water legible as it comes down. That's the new portal. You go through there. You see the steeple. You're sort of oriented. And this detail from the original is the water table. It's transitioning from the face of the brick to a wider base. And we took that water table profile and turned it into a texture across the new building. So it's referencing the historic. It's, of course, not copying it. It's completely different. And the dean was really interested in not mimicking the old. In our meetings, he said, I don't want brick, which is different from a lot of university architects who say, I need brick. And brick is a precondition for this project. But this is terracotta, which gestures to that brick. Over the windows, it transitions to an extruded aluminum, which extends the pattern, but sort of creates a screen and references the proportions of the historic windows. The interior is clad in a curtain wall, but has these sort of solar screens. They're shading the glass, rejecting the heat. They're calibrated also to orientation. So on the south, they're more horizontal. On the east and west, they're more vertical. But you see the kind of references between the old and the new. And it produces this beautiful single-loaded corridor that wraps the courtyard, lets students see each other so they can create that sense of community. And the corridors are super wide, so students hang out in the corridors. They're not just in their rooms. We're trying to build that sense of community. And so this is it right after it opened. And this is the dialogue between old and new. And I think this is one of my favorite photos because we see the windows facing the windows, the gables facing the gables, but it's that dialogue between existing and new. And an interesting story, I went to the ribbon mending ceremony because they didn't want to cut the ribbon, they wanted to assemble it. So the segments of ribbon are being held there by different people. The woman on the left is the president of Yale. Do you know who the president of Yale is? architectural historian Maury McGinnis, who co-authored the book with Lewis Nelson on the history of UVA. And so the president of Yale is like one of the most attuned to these questions that you could even dream of. I was shocked to discover that. Anyways, Maury McGinnis, author of this book, Educated in Tyranny. Amazing, these sort of loops and circles and connections. Okay, 2 more projects I want to share, and then we can talk about these things. The Coolidge, Dietrich mentioned, it's an Art Deco movie theater in Boston. I love going there. They play all the foreign films. They play all the kind of films on real film. I watched Marty Supreme on film. I watched Dunkirk on film. It's not the same as a digital projector. We added to it, and so there's this little alley, and so sticking into the alley is our building. It's an addition. But this is the back of the theater. It's definitely a back. There's dumpsters, there's fire escapes, there's exit doors, and there's cars. There's parked cars. We said, let's turn the back into a new front. We put 2 movie theaters on the back. We respect the marquee on Harvard Street, but in the parking lot we have this new facade, and we do all the diagrams show the egress is maintained. We had new theaters, sort of riffing off of the old ones. I like to tell my students that when you add to a historic building, you can't get too close to it, right? Otherwise, your building will affect the foundations of the old building. So you have to stand back and then cantilever over to meet the new building. So I say our building is kissing the old building. It's just sort of leaning over and almost touching it with the steel. This is the Movie House 5. These are some of the deco details, the herringbone brick. And so our brick also has a kind of texture. And you'll see there's a sort of interest in the part-to-whole relations and making those legible. So our brick is staggered. It follows a curve, almost like the undulation of a curtain. But working with the masons, we figured out how to make it so that every brick is legible. And so we get this beautiful texture. And when the sun moves across this face, because this is south-facing, we get this incredible animation. And I started looking at it, and I thought, oh, you know, that brick isn't quite right. There's imperfections in the brick. But in a way that makes it human. It makes it like, this was made by humans. It's not like set by robots. And more, I think these little flaws, these little quirks are actually what makes the architecture unique and special. And so this was under construction, but I just love the shadows on that brick because it's animating it. And at night, we sort of wash it with light and create that animation. Oh, I lied. There's one more project. Stewart Street. I'll go through this quickly. In Boston, we have all these great neighborhoods. Bay Village is the neighborhood right in the foreground there. We designed a new building in the old neighborhood. It's in the historic landmark district, just barely, right on the edge. And our client was a developer. They wanted to build 21 stories in a historic neighborhood. And everyone said, it can't be done. This is zoned for 40 feet. You want to go 200? Are you crazy? The crazy thing about Boston is that we have sites like this, a parking lot, 7,000 square foot parking lot in the middle of the city, and no one can develop it, so it stays a parking lot. Because it's not easy to develop. And so our client said, I think we can get 7 units on the site, and we laid them out. They said, what's it going to look like? How does it fit in Boston? We said, we have no idea. But let's try some things. So we started making things. We made these plaster casts of these concave panels. And we said, maybe the building is clad in these sort of fluted piers. And we carved them out of limestone, and then we carved them out of EPS foam and mocked them up. And we said there's a relationship between the body and this concavity. And we tried to optimize it for molds. We thought we'll just make a few different molds and mix them around. And here are the molds, 30 feet long. Because I teach construction, I say, make it as big as you can transport. Right? Take it to the site in the biggest piece you can transport that fits on a truck that gets under a bridge. And so I made them 30 feet long, the proportion of a flatbed truck, so they can just be picked up and hung on the building. And we go 3 stories at a time, and we're going to save time, and we're going to be fast, and we're going to be smart. It turns out that that's not the driver for the cost. The driver is actually construction time, speed. But it's not molds, it's actually the crane. And so we had lots of little pieces but it turns out bigger pieces are more efficient. So we optimize it for the crane time, not for the mold, number of molds. Interesting to note. I just think they're so beautiful. Look at that. It's like a Brancusi. It's a void of a Brancusi shaped by a panel of an apartment building. And then watching it go up was incredible. 30-foot panel goes up, and it creates a different sense of scale, because usually we're used to seeing a joint at every floor, right? Conventional construction would subdivide that into sort of floor-sized pieces. But we set the windows back, and we made the windows just like a gap. And so instead of like windows telling you how big it is, it's just these vertical piers, and there's just gaps in between. I think windows are some of the hardest things to design as architects. So I try not to design any windows, just gaps. So the glass is set back, and here you see the gaps between the piers, and they're staggered. They're changing in proportion. So it's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it attenuates as it rises. It creates a weird sense of scale, and from certain angles, it looks like this sort of beautiful fluted figure, like this. And it meets the sky with a sort of undulation. And the windows are just gaps. They're just recessive. It's a taut, dark skin, so you don't read the scale of the building. I think that's what makes it sort of unusual. How it meets the sky is important. How it meets the ground is important. And I said this is a historic neighborhood. On Shawmut Street, there were neighbors in 2-story brick buildings. They are butters, and many of them protested our building, as one does when you're a neighbor. But we said, we're going to turn this empty parking lot into a vibrant home for many new neighbors. And they didn't want a loading dock. They didn't want a mechanical room. They didn't want to look at the back of our building. And so I said, no problem. We'll put the back on the front. Loading is off of Stewart Street. Along Shawmut Street, we have 2 townhouses. They're neighbors. Neighbors look at neighbors. We'll complete the street with more townhouses. And so we did. We have 2 townhomes with stoops and planters and ironwork. And so when they open their door, they're not looking at our loading dock, they're looking at new neighbors. And I did a rendering with the door open and someone waving, because we need to persuade people that this is a good thing. You don't want to look at a parking lot. Jane Jacobs tells us that stoops are places where people gather. That's where the community sees itself. And so applying these lessons to a building, a 20-story building in a 2-story neighborhood, I think was a powerful lesson. And I love this shot because it shows the relationship between the geometry and the body, almost like you could sort of brush up against the building and it would sort of hug you. Last project. If we are to have a great democracy, we must take an active role in our democracy. We must do democracy. I love that. Democracy requires doing. We're designing an Institute of Democracy at the University of Virginia. So we wondered about democracy and spaces of democracy. This is the academical village. We're coming back home. This is the new campus called the Emmett Ivy Corridor. And this building, at the terminus of that axis, is the Institute of Democracy. And so I said, if the old academical village was introverted, this new one will be extroverted. It'll be porous, it'll be inviting. I called it a house with many doors. And instead of a rotunda behind a colonnade of white columns, we have an auditorium for the sort of debate and discussions that surround issues of democracy. So here's the auditorium as a sort of figure. It's on axis with this new lawn. And we made direct relationships between this rotunda and that Institute of Democracy. They're 200 years apart. But the center of the building, you could say, is the auditorium. But I think the shaping of the building is concave and it pushes the center points outside of itself. And the idea that the plaza in front of the building is the sort of focal point, not the building itself. And so it has a different relationship to its context. There's an auditorium embedded inside. There's research spaces around it. I was curious about spaces of democracy, and I wondered if there was something about the shape of the room and the activities within it. You recognize the one on the left. This is the House of Commons, where the the two sides are debating each other. And Winston Churchill did say, first we shape our buildings and then they shape us. He was talking about this room. The particular politics of the English system are based on the shape of the room, where the nobility was on one side and the clergy was on the other, and that sort of formed that sort of structure of debate. I'm intrigued by the round one, the half round, the horseshoe, and the kind of lecture format, the frontal sort of hierarchical structure of the Russian parliament. Anyways, I wondered about these things. We did an exhibition around the shapes of rooms. And as we were designing our own, I said, how should an institute of democracy be shaped? Can we turn every spectator into a participant? How do we get people involved? And so you see that the shape of the room is lined with balconies, and the balconies wrap the whole room. I said, for an institute of democracy, we must offer every possible vantage and every possible perspective. So a 360-degree room from which you could, in a way, change your position. You could stand behind the speaker on the right, you could stand behind the speaker on the left, try to see the world from their perspective. This was something that appealed to the Institute of Democracy, which is not partisan, and they like this idea of the wraparound balcony. So here's the rendering that shows the room. It's an intimate room where everybody's participating. It's the sort of figure within the plan, and it's the sort of figure on axis. You'll notice that the rotunda that Jefferson designed has the bottom floor of these sort of lodged figures, and this oval room is something that the Board of Visitors meets in the oval room. And so we wanted to introduce our own sort of oval room as a kind of figure that's sort of wrapped within this larger figure. And so they're gestures to Jefferson. And recently I saw it sort of being framed out. And then all the devices and all the framing. So it's really exciting to see the shaping, and you can feel the presence and the intimacy of the room. Some diagrams. The facade includes all the sort of concavities that we're sort of excited about, some of the panels going in. It has a kind of thickness that I think is what makes it feel sort of lively and active. And that's it a couple weeks ago. And I like the way the bricks are stitching together on the corner. You know, again, sort of celebrating the difference and the part-to-whole relationships. I will just mention this other book that I've been working on. It's my most recent book. It's based on a class I teach. So I teach, I lecture, the lectures become chapters. The chapters deal with different issues like force and form, climate and conditioning, afterlives, and construction futures. This is just a few images from the introduction. But the last chapter is called Agency and Imagination. And I think that's important because my students, and I think you are, interested in agency. You're interested in how to shape the world. I say architects shape the world at a distance through our drawings. How do we do drawings? How do we learn what to draw? How can we be effective in changing the world? So I like to think about agency and imagination as what we provide. You provide the imagination. We equip you with that agency to work on the world. And that's the conclusion of the book. Monuments was in the title. We've seen the monuments go up. We've seen them come down. Amazingly, the contractor that built our memorial at UVA, Jovan Henry, black-owned business, he was called by the governor of Virginia. He said, can you take down the Confederate monuments? The governor said, you put up a monument, can you take one down? He said, yes, I can. So he said, you've got 2 weeks to take down those monuments. This happened a few years ago. But I was in LA over Christmas, and I visited this show, which is called Monuments. Different artists sort of reworking the Confederate monuments. So these are real Confederate monuments that have been taken down. That's Hank Willis Thomas and his General Lee sculpture. These are monuments from Monument Ave in Richmond that were taken down. This is the statue of General Lee in Charlottesville that was taken down, melted, and then producing these sort of bronze bars. The legacy of these things, their material histories, I think they matter. How we think about monuments, do we erase them, do we contextualize them? How can we learn from the past if it's not there anymore? These are important questions to think about. And maybe just sort of to end back to these individuals. some of them without names. I met a lot of individuals during the process. Colleen Yates is the 7th generation descendant of Sally Hemings. She was an active participant on the memorial project. And the Tiza Gathers told me that she found herself in the memorial process. She didn't know she was a descendant, and then she did over the process. And after the memorial was completed, we added new names to the wall because new names were discovered, and they were carved into the memorial. And so this idea of open-endedness, I think, is also the possibility that scholarship and research will shed new light on this. And I think that's what makes it sort of powerful. Its continued active role. And so I'll stop with a quote, which is from Herbert Simon, who says, "If science is the study of the world as it is, design is the study of the world as it ought to be." And I think that's what we're doing as designers. We're shaping the world the way it ought to be, not the way it is. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric. This was fantastic. I could have easily listened to another 10 buildings and their descriptions. I hope we have some questions. We have microphones here. If you have questions for Eric, please. I have a few myself, but I'll switch on the light and give you the microphone for just to hold it and hand it out to someone who might need it.
Sorry, that was a bit long, but happy to chat if anyone has a question. I'm not sure the mic's on.
On?
There you go.
Thank you so much for coming and giving that talk. It was super interesting and awesome to see all of the buildings you've worked on. I was kind of wondering, the bridge in China was more like integrated with, let's say, the ecological environment, and then that building in Boston was kind of purely in an urban environment. I was wondering if you have a different mindset approaching projects in very different contexts like that, and kind of your thought processes take different avenues when doing different projects.
Huh. I mean, they're totally different, right? One's in China, so like geographically different, culturally different. Our first project in China was really challenging with this, like, it must have Chinese feeling, and we didn't know what that meant. So, you know, there's so much difference, and then how do you communicate that to the mason? Like, how do you speak across cultural difference? But the design approach, I don't know. I think we're always trying to find the thing that's going to seem like it's the right solution for the right place. The double bridge just seemed like it was calling for something that tied the two bridges together, and the sort of geometries and the sort of axes or gestures to the landscape. It just felt right. And we tried lots of things, as you can imagine, but that one felt right to me. The tower in Boston, again, you don't know what it is. You have no preconceptions, but you know, you do your design process, and some of them just speak to you differently. I like to think that design, when there's a good idea, is legible to all, and it almost becomes inevitable. And when I present multiple schemes to clients, they usually pick the right scheme. You know, they usually say, that one makes sense to me. So in a way, we're trying to connect to public audiences, but also, you know, the stakeholders. You know, the descendants at UVA felt that the circle was something that brought people together in a time that was very divisive. You know, we can imagine, and Collier as well, like, people were talking about locking down campuses, they were talking about closing their doors, and we said we can't, and, you know, Islamophobia, like, we cannot turn from our values, and so the idea of an open hand seemed right at that moment. So I don't know what else to say, but, you know, regardless of urban, rural, China, US, we're doing work in India, like, what feels right? What speaks to people? How do they interpret? What's the legibility of an idea across cultures? And I think, like, the little brick masons sort of organizing the bricks, like, that's an idea that doesn't require language. You know, you just need to know what the idea is, and then you can implement it. there's a famous English architect, Lutyens, who said an architectural drawing is a letter to a builder. And I love that, right? It's a letter to a builder. What do you want to say? Please build my building carefully. Please, but it's true. It's a dialogue. It's not just me. It's not a contract document. It's a letter to a builder.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, Mr. Höweler. Thank you for your presentation. I really resonated with when you said, as long as you appreciate that something is missing, it's valuable. And this is kind of an abstract question, I guess, but I wanted to ask if you had any resonance or thoughts on the word redaction.
Redaction. Redaction. Well, redaction is something we talk about a lot with, the moment we live in, right? Epstein files, secret documents, like we cannot, I think, we're living in a moment of post-truth. We don't know what's true anymore. We have all this information, but we don't know what's actually true. And so redaction seems to sum up a lot of what this present moment is about. And I think discernment is one of the critical terms I like to use. It's like when we're bombarded with misinformation, how do we make our own judgments? How do we verify things? Redaction seems like omission. It seems like, obscuring. I don't know if that's what you meant. There's a kind of political version of redaction.
I think there's the political sense, and there's also the, mimetic sense, where it adds the layers. Meanings can change and be redefined by the way things get interpreted, brought to the present or left in the past.
Okay, I like that. That's more hopeful. I like that. I studied architecture in the 80s and 90s, and we talked about architecture as a system of signs and semiotics and reader and subject and object. And I like the idea that architecture is legible, although I don't think it's a system of signs. I think it is legible. It speaks in a way without words, without language. And I like the idea of reinterpretation, that buildings are reinterpreted by different users and meanings can change, right? We can't fix it in time. Raphael Moneo, who was the dean at the GSD, said, there's a solitude of buildings, right? The building has to stand on its own. The architect can't explain it all the time, right? And I love that. The lonely building standing by itself, it needs to speak without the architect. We have to let our buildings go. It's a beautiful image.
Hi there. Thank you so much for this talk. It struck me that there's, with the UVA memorial to enslaved laborers, there's kind of two languages that are in conversation here. One is the language of monuments, these big, pillars and these men on horses that are supposed to be revered, and then the language of architecture that you're using to kind of speak against it. And I wanted to hear what your thoughts are on navigating those two languages in a space like Charlottesville, where people will, encounter monuments and memorials and kind of have them all together in the landscape.
Thank you for noticing that. I always like to clarify, monuments imply a certain scale, monumentality, the man on the horse. They often occupy the center and organize the world around them as an object. And I think we prefer the word memorial, which is scaleless, right? You could have a memorial in your hand. You could have a memorial inside of you. A memorial could be a space where people gather. And so I like to use the word memorial and not monument. Sometimes people refer to the UVA monument, and I'm like, no, it's not a monument, it's a memorial. Because for me, the monument is the guy on the horse. And usually that's not the right person to memorialize. So I like to use the word memorial, but they're often used interchangeably. We very explicitly did not make an object. It's a void, and it's filled by people. And so the horizon line is a useful device for me because it's perceptual, but also it's kind of welcoming, right? It's kind of a gesture. So we were very clear not to make an object that would occupy space, but that would invite people to fill it. Yeah, there's probably a lot more to say about memory and architecture. And I think I try to show projects like whether it's cultural memory, like their buildings in China, or memory of specific historic moments with timelines and words. We don't really talk about memory in architecture that much, right? Maybe meaning more than memory. But I do think buildings embody values that we inscribe in them, right? Just walking around Brown's campus, there's so many incredible buildings. There's such a kind of wealth, an architectural wealth in the materials and the forms. There's all kinds of meaning and values that are inscribed in that. I think for me, it's interesting to think about what's a contemporary value that we want to manifest in our architecture. How do we speak about this moment and our values? And I think that's what I tell my students, like, give me something authentic of this time. And how do you translate your values into your architecture? We often talk about form and novelty, maybe meaning, but not values. And I think that value is something that I'd like to hear more about in students' work, if that helps. Thanks. I think that was it. That was it. Okay, thank you so much.